Hi, I'm Van. Thanks for joining me today. Were the early Christians socialists or communists for that matter? Some say yes, but let's look in the scriptures and see if that's true. There's two passages in the New Testament book of Acts that some say show the early church practicing socialism or communism. Here they are. In the book of Acts, it says, all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Now that's in Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. Now, the full number of those, it goes on to say in another passage, now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to them was his own, but they had everything in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid them at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to each as any had need. Now that's in Acts chapter 4, verses 32, 34, and 35. Now, you'll sometimes hear people point to these passages and say something like this. This is outright socialistic redistribution amongst the first followers of Jesus Christ. Or some will just say that the early Christians practiced communism. Now, at first glance, it may appear that the first century church modeled an early form of socialism or communism. After all, it said they had everything in common. But we should notice at least two realities that make the sharing in the early church different from socialism and especially communism. First, there is no evidence that the first Christians shared in the means of production, no record that they abolished private property. Those are key elements within the idea of socialism, the means of production and also the eradication or abolishment of private property. It said, notice in the passage it said their possessions. In other words, it belonged to them. It didn't belong to just anybody and everybody. It was their possessions that they sold. We also must acknowledge that what was going on in the book of Acts was an emergency aid-based event. Also, the distribution of possessions in the book of Acts was not by force or coercion. It wasn't like they passed something through Congress or it was an act of the Supreme Court. No, it was chosen freely and voluntarily, something that you will not find in the records of socialism and communism of the past. So the, quote, everything in common phrase spoke to the love of the Christians, not to a law among the Christians. It's also been pointed out that the verb tenses communicate that the property was not liquidated once and for all. For example, the NIV translation of the book of Acts, chapter 4, verse 34 reads like this: from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them and brought money from the sale and brought it to the apostles' feet. In other words, the early Christians did not all immediately liquidate their material resources and pool their money. Rather, as is often done now, when needs arise within the church, those with material resources meet the needs from time to time. What we should say about these passages is that the early church did not promote economic equality, but rather it did pursue economic justice. It's tempting to fall for the cries for economic equality, but shouldn't we expect a variation in material possessions in a world where God creates individuals with various gifts, talents, and abilities? Well, the answer is yes. That's what we should expect. And we need to be careful that we not make the Bible say more than it means to say. And that means if we want to argue for the rightness of free market capitalism, we'll have to do it based on something other than direct spiritual obligation. But the answer to the original question we asked, were the original Christians socialists or communists? Absolutely not. So don't fall for all the rhetoric you're hearing about socialism and communism. You won't find biblical support for it. You won't find biblical support for capitalism, either one. But what you'll find evidence in the scripture is a broken world and a promise of a new creation to come through Christ. Thanks for watching. I'd love to know what you think about this. Leave me a comment in the comment section. If you like this video, leave me a like and certainly share it with somebody that you might feel like would be helpful for them. And also consider subscribing to my channel. I'm Van Unfiltered.